topic of my remarks today is trends in journalism, which could actually be the topic for a full semester course, and maybe it already is, or maybe someday it will be. And my purpose here is to kind of give you a view of kind of three key things that I see happening. I'll try to tie them all together at the end. I'm going to give you a few words of wisdom from somebody who has been at the school fewer days than you all have been, and then kind of open it up to questions. Fortunately, the barbecue is about 3 blocks away, so you won't be tempted by the wafting fumes and can pay attention at least a little bit. You've all heard about kind of the big changes that the internet has brought to our industry, and the sort of glib, kind of easy, 100-word summary of it is that the newspaper industry had kind of plateaued after all the afternoon papers died years ago, and circulation and advertising was decreasing a little bit per year, but nothing that bad. Then online was kind of growing at 20% a year, and the hope of kind of everybody in the industry, not 10 or 20 years ago, but literally like 2 years ago, was that the kind of traditional print model, and this is the newspaper industry, but it really applies to broadcast as well, the traditional model would kind of hold tight long enough while online would continue its huge growth rates, and at a certain point they would kind of cross and online would kind of save the day. And what's happened, as you've seen, is that online is kind of growing actually not as fast as it used to, while in this past year the traditional media had just kind of gone off the cliff. And that's the kind of sort of basic sort of 2-minute summary that most big media executives will give you, and then they kind of throw their hands up and say, well, I'm 62, I'm looking forward to retirement, I'm sure that you'll figure it out. But there's a lot more going on in the media world, and if there wasn't, I suspect most of you would have found another graduate school to go to. And so I'm very happy you're here, and I'm very happy that I'm here to help work on this with you. So I'm going to talk about what's happening, but I have 2 big caveats that I want to just express up front. My first caveat is that while I'm going to be talking almost purely about online during my speech today, I just want to warn you that it is easy and very simple and very common, unfortunately, especially for journalists, to kind of extrapolate from what they see now to kind of what they assume the future will be down the road. Gordon Krovitz, who was the publisher of the Wall Street Journal until recently and was my boss when he was running the online division, used to say that when it comes to consumer technology trends, people always overestimate the immediate adoption, and then they underestimate the sort of adoption a few years down the road. But regardless of what I say, it shouldn't be taken to mean that the Dallas Morning News is going to be purely online, that the New Yorker will disappear from print, and that we'll all be reading books on Amazon Kindle by the end of the year. That's just not going to happen. There's just too much there are just too many reasons why that won't happen. And it is very easy to exaggerate the sort of impact of the internet. And there's a lot of really intelligent people who have addressed this issue, but I want to show a short clip from one of my personal heroes, Michael Scott, who is the district manager of the Dunder Mifflin office in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Oh, I should set this up. This is an episode from about a year ago where he was going to be confronted by somebody who needed a raise, so he brought Jim, one of his employees, in to kind of do a practice run through.
I want you to be Daryl and ask me for a raise because I need to try out some of these negotiation tactics. Where'd you get that? Wikipedia. Wikipedia is the best thing ever. Anyone in the world can write anything they want about any subject, so you know you are getting the best possible information.
I love that quote. Actually, Jimmy Wales, who is the creator of Wikipedia, came to the journal about a year ago, and we showed it to him. He hadn't seen it. He loved it, too. Now I'm going to go from Michael Scott to somebody you may not be quite as familiar with, which is Plato. Plato, as some of you may have studied in your college days, had wrote about the allegory of the cave. This has to be the first time at Columbia anybody's ever gone from an episode of The Office to Plato. But for those of you who aren't aware of it, and I'm not going to take you through the whole thing, I promise, what he wrote about was that he came up with this allegory where there were prisoners who, as you can see, were seated in the front. This was not drawn by Plato. This was many years later. And they had been chained there since birth. Their heads were fixed, and all they could see was this wall. And upon the wall were cast shadows where puppets would show various objects that were illuminated by the fire behind them. And his point here was that the men who were being chained there assumed that what they saw as shadows were the real thing. So if they saw a shadow of an elk, they would assign a name to it, and they assumed that the shadow was actually what it was. And without taking you through the whole allegory, because then a couple men escape and they see the light, and then they come back, and there's a whole drama there. I just have to tell you that many journalists are sort of like those prisoners right there. They sort of see, and I think all of us are a little bit like this. We sort of see little glimpses of what's happening. We see online growth. We see problems in the print industry. We see all these layoffs. And you can kind of come up with conclusions that sort of fit that data. But the truth is, nobody really fully understands where this is going. So what I'm going to talk about are some of the things that I see happening now. The other little caveat I'm going to give you is that I'm going to mention a few people who have done tremendous things online. You should see them more for what they tend to represent about opportunities broadly, not so much as role models for your own careers. So with that, let me talk about the trend number one, which I will call the explosion of news sources. Now, it's pretty easy to wax nostalgic about the good old days, but the truth is, there were a lot of disadvantages. There were a lot of disadvantages to the way that things used to get done. One of the worst was that if you ever wanted to get numerous viewpoints about a certain news story, you would wind up going to a place like this, which some of you may have seen. This is what we used to call an out-of-town newsstand. I think this one still exists because it's right outside of Harvard, but most of them, is it still there? Yeah. Okay. Most of them have pretty much disappeared, and for fairly obvious reasons. When I was a kid growing up in Colorado, there was an out-of-town newsstand right near the Greyhound bus station. And if you showed up like at 2 p.m. on a Thursday, the papers from Salt Lake and Omaha would have just arrived. If you wanted, those were the Wednesday papers. If you wanted 48-hour papers, the papers from Chicago and St. Louis were there, and 72-hour old papers, from the East and West Coast. Those were just kind of being trucked in. They were tremendously expensive because they had been kind of shipped across the country. And this was the way that you sort of got multiple news sources because there just wasn't that much available out there. This now is what I would call the new out-of-town newsstand. Do any of you know what this is? I mean, it's page flakes. This is an RSS aggregator. How many of you use some form of RSS aggregation? Okay, that's great. And I hope by the end of this year, when I ask you that question, every hand will go up. This is called Page Flakes. It's the one I happen to use. There's a lot of other ones called FeedBurner. You can use my Yahoo page. And as you can see, what RSS aggregators do is they yank headlines off of websites. And one of the nice things about Page Flakes, as well as others, is you can run your mouse over and you can basically get a sense of kind of what each media outlet is saying about pretty much anything that you're interested in. And you can load it up with anything. I've got the weather, I've got the Yankees, you've got Facebook, you've got The Onion, where I learn a lot of my news, you've got movies, TV. And then if you're a junkie in something, then you can really do a deep dive. So here's my media page, and I've got Romanesco, obviously. I've got the Journal and the Times, got CJR. I didn't just put that in, they were there before. Buzz Machine, which is this guy named Jeff Jarvis, who always has something provocative to say. This is a great site, Reflections of a News Disorder, done by a fellow who used to be a venture capitalist. And then my real passion in news is politics, so I have a separate politics page. And on this one, I've kind of done the lefty blogs on the left and the kind of middle of the road ones in the middle and the righty ones on the right. And so as you all hopefully know, John McCain named his vice presidential candidate today, Sarah Palin from Alaska. And sort of when like a news story breaks, you just see the news headlines kind of flow in. And you can see all these different viewpoints of it. During the Obama speech last night, or right after the speech was over, I went to this page, and there were 20 or 30 posts, and they weren't all great, but there were a lot of great ones. And within about 10 minutes, I kind of knew the sort of general, maybe not consensus, but the general breadth of comment and intelligent thought about Obama's speech. Not that there won't be a lot more written that will surpass that, but you know, this is my purpose here is not to give a skills course in how to set up an RSS page, but I kind of want you to think about kind of being a journalist in an era when people can pull not just your journalism, but that from many, many other sources around the world and have kind of instantaneous access to your journalism. It fundamentally puts you in a very different place. When I was at the Miami Herald about 10 or 12 years ago, I used to watch people buy the newspaper every day. We were in a very competitive war in Broward County, which is just north of Miami, against the Sun Sentinel. And so I used to actually watch people buy the paper. And this is 1994, 1995. People would buy the paper out of the newsstand, and as often as not, they would actually literally take big sections of the paper out and throw them in the garbage. There would be people who would take the arts and leisure section out so they could check the movie listings that night. I mean, do any of you use a newspaper to find out what movie's playing? It's just hard to imagine. Other people would pull the sports section out and junk the rest of the paper. So the idea of a big metro paper, I mean, in those days, there weren't that many alternatives. So the big metro paper had its MO as this kind of aggregator of content that various discrete populations wanted to read. One of the reasons metro papers are having so much trouble, beyond the way they cover local news in some cases, even the very good ones are having a lot of trouble because a lot of that aggregation and a lot of that information gathering is being done by people on their own. You don't really have to wait for tomorrow morning's paper to see how the Yankees did or why Jabba Chamberlain was pulled in the third inning. You can go out to ESPN.com or on the MLB TV and you can get your answer right there. So this is something to think about and something that really we could have an entire course on the impact of news aggregation. But it's really hard to overestimate the impact of it. When you start doing this, you see the world fundamentally differently than before. You don't see yourself limited to specific sources of information, and you don't see as much of a need for a filter for your information because you become your own filter. Again, a caveat. What I've done here and what a lot of you have done requires not a tremendous amount of tech savvy, but it requires a certain willingness to kind of go in there and bring in feeds, which is why, I read various estimates. It's like 10 or 20 million people in the United States do this, which is not a huge number. The truth is you actually see a lot of RSS feeds on sites, you just don't realize it. But once somebody figures out kind of how to passively aggregate content, how to sort of judge your interests the way Amazon does, populating their homepage based on books that you bought before, then you start seeing how this really changes the model for what we used to do in journalism. Trend number 2, engagement of the readers. Engaging readers means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Not that long ago, what it meant was you would have a box on the editorial page that would say, if you have a letter you'd like to send to the editor, here's the address. And you would send it in, and would kind of go into the vapor, and maybe it'd be published a few days later. Maybe it wouldn't. If it was published, it would inevitably be trimmed down. Whether people would read it or not, it wasn't all that clear. Obviously, the web provides some really interesting new ways to engage readers. Now, the most basic one is simply opening up stories to comments or blog posts to comments. And frankly, I'm not going to go into this so much. I'm sure you've all seen it. This happens to be a really interesting site if you've never seen it before. It's on the Guardian website, which is probably the most popular out-of-country website in the United States. And there's this really brilliant person who runs it named Emily Bell. They started this thing called Comment is Free, where they bring in a host of commentators. It's a little bit like the Huffington Post, but kind of done on a somewhat different level. And if you look over here on the right, you'll see they have kind of the most commented columns. And you can see the numbers, 770, 715, 359. I mean, this thing has a real audience. When you're getting 700 or 800 comments on like a single posting, then it means that you've reached a certain critical mass. The comments, I almost don't even want to talk too much about this because I think this is what passed for engagement of readers a few years ago, and it's kind of basic, and frankly, if you read a lot of comment fields, it's frankly not that uplifting of an experience, but I'll just kind of pass it on to you. The sort of next big thing of engaging readers is trying to bring them into the news gathering process. And, I'm going to lead up to something, so don't all start freaking out that you won't have jobs because citizens will be doing all of your journalism. The first kind of breakthrough event, I think, on this was the tsunami in 2004, where various media started getting cell phone photos and other kinds of images from that tragedy. The CNN website has started something recently called IReport, where they allow people to basically kind of send them files, send them clips from various news events. And it says that it's unfiltered, but I think they actually do provide some kind of filter. This page I thought was kind of interesting. What it shows is, you remember a couple days ago when the FAA had that glitch and flights all over the country were being delayed. So they went to their readers on their homepage and said, send us your story. And of course, almost everybody these days at an airport has a laptop, and these people are just bored, brainless, so they have to have something to do. So they ended up getting, well, there's the 7 pages times 5 or something, get me out of this airport delay on plane. And, this is a little crude and it's a little hokey, but you can kind of see where this is going. If you had a lot of people at the Denver airport posting and your sister was flying in from Denver, you could kind of see that. As I say, the results are not always perfect, and I'm gonna, this is my favorite guy. This is a made-up version of IReport. He sent in a report. It was put on the CNN homepage. So he did a report about being on the homepage.
CNN.com and IReport.com. Check it out.
So here he is at the airport, showing that his report is on the homepage.
I interviewed people, and look where it gets us. FAA computer phones causing flight delays. This is CNN here. And then go down.
Needs a little work with the focus.
Delays concern Philly travelers. IReport. Stuck in Philadelphia.
So he's filming himself being on CNN. And unfortunately, it doesn't show how many, it did get 5 ratings. So there he is. Please don't do this at home, all right? If I catch any of you doing this, you're in big trouble. So there's kind of that level, which is the sort of very basic kind of, if you see something, try to let us know, and don't just call us, send us in your video. Then there's the kind of next level of reader engagement. And there's, how many of you have heard of this site? It's run by Josh Marshall called Talking Points Memo. So you all remember about a year ago, the Department of Justice came under scrutiny because of their hiring practices. A number of U.S. attorneys around the country were being dismissed, and in their stead were being brought in prosecutors of, shall we say, not great stature, who were basically known for their loyalty to the Bush administration and to their adherence to a certain train of thought. So Josh Marshall, who's been running the site for a few years and has hired his own relatively small coterie of staff writers, started attacking this story pretty hard. And full disclosure, he's something of a partisan. He's fairly open about it, but he is something of a partisan. But he also is a journalist, and he kind of knows the story when he sees one. And he started just relentlessly, day after day, the way good journalists do, looking for tips, pursuing them where they went. And then at a certain point, the DOJ, the Department of Justice, dumped around 3,000 pages of documents. It was one of these kind of 5 p.m. on a Friday sort of thing. And I don't know how many of you have ever been in a newsroom when a big, weighty indictment comes out, and it's like an hour and a half before deadline, you're tearing your hair out, and your editor's giving you a hard time, and you're there by yourself, and the computer crashes, and your Diet Coke spills on the keyboard. So what he did, because he has a very close sense of his readers, was he said, go to the DOJ website and help me sort through these things, because there were just massive amounts of stuff. And sure enough, within a couple of days, or actually within a couple of hours, I should say, a number of his readers started highlighting things in those 3,000 pages that they thought was interesting. There was this one reader who found this one email that Monica Goodling sent about kind of, how to inflict certain standards from the Federalist Society on some of the new hires. Now, something tells me that this wasn't on page 2 of the 3,000 pages. And then there was another document dump. He went back to his readers. And this is kind of an interesting technique, because what he was doing was saying, help identify the content for me. I'm still going to be the editor of it, but I need your help to kind of bring to light things that I don't have the staff or the time to be able to do. Does anybody know how his coverage ended up? He ended up winning the George Polk Award for the legal coverage, which is the Polk Award, I think Sig would agree with me, is one step below the Pulitzers, or sort of in that group right below the Pulitzer. What's that? Golden Globe. Let me just say, at the Journal, when anybody wins a Polk Award, it's a really big deal. And the Journal would have been very happy to have won this award. And again, I don't want to exaggerate. He had his own people sifting through this. They were not just kind of putting the comments and the emails up unfiltered, but he was engaging them in a very interesting and kind of new way of doing it. The third trend, which all of you have seen, all of you know, and it's the willingness to innovate and to create new voices and opportunities online. I want to bring up two people who have done two very interesting but very different things online. This is a site called the FiveThirtyEight.com. Anybody seen it? Anybody aware of it? The guy who runs this is a guy named Nate Silver. You could do a Wikipedia search for him. He has a huge bio on Wikipedia. Very jealous. He's about 30 years old, and he's a University of Chicago economics major, really smart. And a few years ago, he created a system spelled PECOTA, PECOTA, which is, if like anybody's into baseball or the fantasy baseball leagues, they probably heard of it. It's this very sort of interesting way of taking data about baseball players and figuring out how good they are and how good they're going to be this season. And it ended up being bought by Baseball Prospectus. It was this, in that world of people who are really into fantasy baseball or just into knowing more about baseball players, this was like a breakthrough in terms of how to crunch data. But he was also really into politics, and because he had been at the University of Chicago, he was very interested in Obama. So he took the same techniques that he used in baseball and applied it to the election, and is applying it to the election, is applying it to the polling specifically. And what he does is what you see on the Real Clear Politics site and a number of others is they will take 8 or 10 polls from the past 2 weeks, average them out, and say, oh, Obama's ahead by 2 points in Minnesota, he's behind by 3 points in Indiana. And to Nate, and I talked to him before I did this, he felt, and he's right, that's actually a very crude model, because you're basically assuming the best, and you're sort of equally giving, you're giving the same kind of weighting to basically every poll out there, which is really not good science. What he did was he started modeling out previous elections based on criteria he came up with, which included polls, but also included a lot of demographic data, included a lot about voting patterns. And he did thousands and thousands of models till he refined a formula by which, by the time he did Super Tuesday, he came within about 10 delegates of how Obama and Hillary Clinton were going to do. He was so much more accurate than anybody else. It was just stunning. And Bill Kristol and a number of others who really follow this stuff, sort of, they had like a new god. And I was talking to him just yesterday about sort of how he got into this and what it was that made him make the transition from baseball to politics. And he said it's because baseball fans and political junkies are basically the exact same kind of people. They really love data, they're passionate about it, and there's a lot of bad information out there. And so he wanted to serve that audience. And you know, I don't know what the traffic to the site is. I know it gets linked to from multiple sources. I know when he puts a posting up, within an hour or two, it'll have 50 to 100 comments, and then it just goes from there. And he is building kind of a real name for himself online, whereas if he had gone to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and said, hey, you know, I've got this kind of interesting way of crunching data, would you be interested in seeing it? They may have shown him the door. The other guy I'm going to talk about is the guy who created this site, paidcontent.org. Any of you seen this one? It's by a guy named Rafat Ali. Sri knows him very well. He writes about content online and the sort of underlying business model. So this is actually worth putting on your bookmarks page. And he had a very interesting route. He also got a master's in journalism. His was from Indiana. And he had a big interest in online media. So he worked for a while at a site called inside.com, which blew up. That was the Kurt Anderson site. This is back in the 90s. Then he went to, I think, Silicon Alley. That blew up. And so he sort of had this real interest in this field, but he couldn't find a place to write about it that would stay in business for more than a few months. So he started on his own this blog called paidcontent.org, which is mainly kind of an aggregator, but also doing some original reporting on his own. As he told me, he said he actually created it so when he came to apply to the Wall Street Journal, for example, or he went to thestreet.com, he could show them this blog and say, see, you should hire me because I have this interest in them. Well, he didn't get jobs anywhere. But what happened was that the blog itself kind of took off. And what he did, what was so interesting and why this became kind of a must-read among pretty much every media executive I know, is what he did was he didn't just say, I'm going to look at the business model of online newspapers, or I'm going to look at the business model of online music. What he realized was there was this commonality of interests across all these companies, whether it was EMI or Dow Jones or Time AOL, where they were all trying to figure out this kind of trick of what do you do with content online, whether it's an MP3 file or a story or a video. And so he actually created his like own new audience, unlike the FiveThirtyEight.com, which kind of plugged into political junkies, an existing audience. He basically created his own audience. And he figured that out, and that was really smart of him. And you know how smart it was? He sold his site to The Guardian a few months ago for what, about $28 or $30 million? $30 million. It's really unfortunate he's not an alumnus of Columbia Journalism School. And, you know, as he said, if I'd gotten that job at the Journal, I never would have created the site. Josh Marshall from Talking Points Memo told the LA Times a few months ago, if I quickly happened into a staff position at the New Yorker, I probably never would have done this. And again, you know, going back to my first caveat, I assume and I hope that many of you, when you leave here, will get jobs at traditional media companies. Some of you may go off on your own and do ventures like this. But no matter how traditional a media company is, you need to bring this kind of mindset, not just to your future work, but to your studies here at the Columbia Journalism School. This idea of kind of figuring out who your audience is, creating new audiences, engaging readers, and doing that journalism in an environment where all this content can be aggregated and accessed by people down the street or halfway across the world gives you remarkable opportunities. I'm going to give you a few words of advice, and then I want to hear back from you. First of all, as you all know, I'm very new here. I still haven't unpacked my boxes upstairs, but I hope starting Tuesday, you'll see a lot more of me. Don't be surprised if I drop in your class from time to time. I'm still learning about this place, and one of the best ways to understand it is by visiting classes and to see what you're learning. When I come into your classroom, don't shut up and don't show off, you know. The professor's the professor of your class. I'm simply there to kind of observe and sort of see what you're learning and kind of see what you're giving back to the class. And a few words of advice from somebody who went to grad school and kind of wish I had heard some of these things myself. One of the interesting things about this J school is that it's a pass-fail program. And I think it's a liberating thing in many ways. There's, as you all know better than I do, having been in college more recently than I have, there is a gamesmanship that goes into grades that is time-consuming, energy-consuming, and you are liberated from that now. You can really do your work. And virtually all of you are going to manage to graduate from the school, but what the real question is how much do you put into it? Because how much you get out is directly related to how much you put in. I want you to take advantage of where you are. This faculty, whether it's new faculty like Howard French, whether it's established professors like Ari Goldman, these people know as much about journalism as you will find, or more about journalism than you will find in pretty much any newsroom in America today. Not only do they have this experience and this breadth of knowledge, but they have something that most editors don't have, and that's time. They are here to teach you, to help you learn, and to hear back from you. And you will never have an environment like this again, I suspect, where you'll have this kind of concentrated faculty eager and willing to help you. And finally, related to everything we just talked about, I hope you'll take a moment to realize how deep your responsibility is as a journalist, and never more so than in the years to follow after you leave Columbia. Young journalists are always told this, and it's always in the sense of you have a responsibility to your readers, to the integrity of your outlet, and to yourself, and that is all true. But you also have a responsibility now to our industry, which I think probably previous classes may not have felt or been in the position to affect as much. Democracy works badly when the press is not healthy and vigorous. County commissioners are more likely to take bribes, bad schools go unrecognized, heroes in the community get unremarked, presidents and congresses go off on foreign adventures that they probably ought not to. And it's really, there are many things that have changed in this world, but the role of the press and the vitality of the press is never more important than it is now. But it's also being questioned. So you have a responsibility, not just to your careers and not just to your readers, which are incredibly important, but to help us all through this journey that we're going to make to sort of push journalism into the 21st century and create models that are going to make it vibrant and healthy for a long time. That's my remarks.